Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
When my parents told me they were taking my brother on a luxury vacation without me, I thought it was a joke. It wasn't. But what they didn't expect was that when they came back, I wouldn't be there waiting for them. And that decision changed everything. Dinner that Friday night started off like any other. My mom had made her famous lasagna, and the conversation was light. Updates about work, school, and the usual small talk. My brother, Ethan, was unusually quiet, a smug little smirk playing on his lips that I chalked up to some private joke I wasn't in on. Then, out of nowhere, my mom said it. "We're going to Hawaii in a couple of weeks," she announced, her tone casual but with an undeniable excitement. "It's going to be amazing." I froze, fork halfway to my mouth. A family trip to Hawaii? That sounded like a dream. I could already picture the beaches, the sunsets, the endless pineapple smoothies. "Wow, really?" I asked, a grin spreading across my face. But something about the way my parents exchanged a quick look, like they were bracing for something, made my excitement falter. And then Ethan's smirk widened, which only made me more suspicious. "Not all of us," my dad added, his voice too nonchalant, like he was trying to soften the blow before it even landed. "It's just going to be the three of us. Me, your mom, and your brother." For a second, I thought he was joking. I even laughed, waiting for them to crack a smile and let me in on the joke. But no one laughed. My mom just sipped her water like this was a completely normal thing to say, and my brother started poking at his lasagna, clearly enjoying my confusion. "Wait, what?" I said, blinking at them. "You're going to Hawaii without me?" "We figured you'd prefer to stay home," my dad said, still avoiding my eyes. "You've got school to focus on, and we didn't want to disrupt your schedule." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Disrupt my schedule?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Ethan has school too." My mom finally spoke, her tone annoyingly calm. "Yes, but Ethan's been under a lot of pressure lately. He's been working so hard, and we thought he deserved a little break." "Are you kidding me?" I said, my face heating up. "I've been working hard too. I've got exams coming up, essays to write, a part-time job." "You're handling it so well," my dad interrupted, like that was supposed to be a compliment. "We're really proud of you. That's why we thought you'd understand." "Understand?" I snapped. "You're leaving me behind to go on a luxury vacation, and you expect me to be okay with it?" Ethan finally chimed in, leaning back in his chair with that infuriating smirk still plastered on his face. "Relax. It's not a big deal. We'll bring you back a souvenir or something." I turned to him, my hands clenched in a fist under the table. "Oh, great. A keychain shaped like a pineapple. That'll totally make up for it." My parents exchanged another one of those looks, and I realized they weren't going to budge. This wasn't up for discussion. It was already decided. I pushed my chair back and stood up, my appetite completely gone. "Thanks for dinner," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "Enjoy your trip." I stormed upstairs and slammed my door, my mind racing. I couldn't believe this was happening. A family trip to Hawaii, and I wasn't invited? The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. It wasn't just about the trip. It was about what it represented. They didn't see me. Not really. To them, I was the responsible one, the reliable one, the one who didn't need attention or care. But that didn't make it hurt any less. As I sat on my bed, staring at the wall, one thing became clear. This wasn't just about Hawaii. This was about how little they valued me. And if they couldn't see my worth, then maybe it was time I showed them. I sat there in stunned silence, replaying their words over and over in my head. It didn't make sense. This had to be some kind of miscommunication, a bad joke I wasn't in on. "Wait, what?" I asked, trying to force a laugh that didn't come naturally. "You're serious?" My mom didn't even look up from her plate. She casually twirled her fork in her lasagna, as if this conversation wasn't completely upending my world. "It's just that your brother has been working so hard lately," she said in that matter-of-fact tone she used when she thought she was being reasonable. "He deserves a little break." Her words hit me like a slap. I felt the sting of them before I could even fully process what she was saying. "And I don't," I managed to say, my voice trembling despite my best effort to stay composed. My dad chimed in, clearly trying to diffuse the situation. "Don't make this a big deal," he said, his voice so casual it only made me angrier. "We'll bring you something back. Maybe a nice souvenir." "A souvenir? A souvenir?" The audacity of it made my blood boil. My brother was getting a luxury vacation. White sand beaches, five-star resorts, endless opportunities to relax. And I was supposed to be content with a cheap trinket they picked up at the airport gift shop? I glanced at Ethan, who was thoroughly enjoying my meltdown. He was leaning back in his chair, arms crossed, with that infuriating smirk plastered across his face. He didn't even bother pretending to feel bad about it. Are you kidding me? I snapped, looking back at my parents. I've been working hard too. I've got school, a part-time job, and I'm still trying to keep up with everything at home. But I guess none of that matters, right? Because Ethan deserves a break. My mom finally looked up, her expression more annoyed than apologetic. It's not about playing favorites, she said. We just thought this would be a good opportunity for him. And besides, you've always been so independent. We knew you'd understand. I stared at her, struggling to comprehend how she could say something so dismissive. Independent? I echoed, my voice rising. That's just code for, we don't have to worry about you. My dad sighed heavily, clearly tired of the conversation. Look, it's already decided. There's no use arguing about it. It's just a trip. We'll be back in a week, and everything will go back to normal. But nothing about this felt normal. The more they talked, the more I realized this wasn't just about the trip. This was about how they saw me, or rather, how they didn't. As the conversation dragged on, it became clear that they didn't think they were doing anything wrong. In their eyes, I was overreacting, blowing things out of proportion. They genuinely believed that leaving me behind was no big deal. The worst part was the way they framed it, like they were doing me a favor. You'll have the whole house to yourself, my mom said, trying to make it sound like a treat. You can focus on your schoolwork without any distractions. Ethan chimed in with a chuckle. Yeah, and you don't even like sand that much, right? You're always complaining about how messy it is. His comment was so absurd, I didn't even know how to respond. This wasn't about sand or school or distractions. It was about being left out, about feeling invisible in my own family. By the time the conversation ended, my appetite was completely gone. I pushed my plate away and mumbled something about needing to study before retreating to my room. Upstairs, I sat on my bed, staring blankly at the wall. The anger I had felt at the table was gone, replaced by a hollow, sinking feeling. It wasn't just the trip. It was the realization that I didn't matter to them as much as I thought I did. I replayed the conversation in my head, dissecting every word, every dismissive comment. They saw me as the responsible one, the one who didn't need attention or special treatment. And maybe that had been true for a long time, but it didn't make it right. As I sat there, the unfairness of it all began to settle in. They didn't see my hard work. They didn't see my sacrifices. They didn't see me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, my mind racing with questions I didn't have answers to. Why wasn't I enough? Why did Ethan get to have it all while I was left behind? And most importantly, what was I going to do about it? Because one thing was certain, I couldn't just sit here and let this happen. Something had to change. For the first time, I started to wonder if maybe it wasn't just about them leaving me behind on this trip. Maybe it was about something much bigger, something I'd been ignoring for too long. The days leading up to their trip were a slow torture. My parents barely mentioned the vacation unless it was to discuss logistics, packing lists, flight times, or itinerary details. They spoke about it with such casualness, like it was the most normal thing in the world to leave me behind. Ethan, of course, didn't miss a single opportunity to rub it in. I can't wait to try surfing, he said one morning, scrolling through videos of people riding crystal-clear waves. Oh, and did I tell you? The resort has a private infinity pool. But it's even better than the pictures. I ignored him at first, but he was relentless. Every day, he found a new way to flaunt their plans. Do you think I'll get tan? He asked at dinner one night, holding his arm out for inspection. Or will I just burn? I guess that's what the cabanas are for. I wanted to scream at him, to remind him that he wasn't the only person in the world who deserved nice things. But I bit my tongue. I knew he wasn't worth it. The night before they left, my mom pulled me aside. I thought for a split second that maybe she was going to apologize or at least acknowledge how unfair this was. But instead, she handed me a handwritten list. We're trusting you with this, she said, her tone serious. It's really important that everything runs smoothly while we're gone. I glanced at the paper, my stomach sinking. The list was full of household chores, watering the plants, taking out the trash, checking the mail, and making sure the house didn't look empty. Are you kidding me? I asked, holding up the list. So, not only are you leaving me behind, but I get to play housekeeper while you're gone. My mom sighed, clearly tired of my attitude. It's not like that. You're part of this family, and everyone has to pitch in. Besides, it's only for a week. You'll be fine. The words "you'll be fine" felt like nails on a chalkboard. They were the same words she had used every time she dismissed something I was upset about, as if my feelings were too insignificant to matter. When the morning of their departure finally came, The house was buzzing with excitement. Excitement I wasn't a part of. My parents were rushing around with last-minute packing, and Ethan was already in vacation mode, wearing flip-flops and a tacky Hawaiian shirt like he was some kind of Instagram influencer. I stayed in my room as long as possible, not wanting to watch the final preparations. But when I heard the car engine start, I couldn't resist looking out the window. There they were loading their luggage into the trunk, laughing and chatting as if this were just another family outing. I felt a lump rise in my throat as I watched them pile into the car. They didn't even glance back at the house as they drove away. Standing at the window, I felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and a creeping sense of relief. For the first time in weeks, the house was silent. I didn't have to listen to Ethan's taunts or my parents' dismissive reassurances. It was just me, and in that silence, something shifted. I spent the first few hours pacing the house, unsure of what to do with myself. Part of me wanted to scream, to throw something, to let all the pent-up frustration out. But instead, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the list my mom had left for me. It wasn't the chores themselves that bothered me. It was what they represented. This list wasn't about trusting me or relying on me. It was about control. It was about making sure I stayed in my place while they went off to enjoy themselves. I crumpled the paper in my hand and threw it in the trash. For the first time, I realized I didn't have to follow their rules. They weren't here to enforce them, and honestly, what could they do about it? As the day went on, that strange sense of clarity grew stronger. This wasn't just about a trip to Hawaii. It was about how I'd been treated my entire life, overlooked, undervalued, and taken for granted. And now, with the house empty and nothing but time on my hands, I finally had a chance to figure out what I wanted. That night, I sat on the couch with a notebook and started making a list of my own. It wasn't a list of chores or responsibilities. It was a list of dreams, goals, and things I wanted for myself. For the first time, I started thinking about what my life could look like if I wasn't waiting for their approval. What if I didn't stay here, cleaning up after them and waiting for scraps of their attention? What if I built a life where I was the priority? As I wrote, a plan began to form in my mind. It wasn't fully fleshed out yet, but I knew one thing for sure. When they came back, they wouldn't find the same version of me waiting for them. The first few days after they left were strangely quiet. The kind of quiet that wasn't peaceful but oppressive, like the house itself was mocking me. Every corner seemed to hold a reminder of what I wasn't a part of. Family photos on the wall, Ethan's sneakers left by the door, and the empty living room where they had spent the night before their trip excitedly planning their itinerary. I tried to go about my days as normally as possible. I woke up, made coffee, and pretended to focus on my schoolwork. But the silence pressed in on me, a constant reminder that I was alone. Even mundane tasks like folding laundry or making dinner felt heavier, as though the weight of their absence was stitched into every action. By the fourth night, I couldn't take it anymore. I found myself sitting at the dinner table with a plate of reheated leftovers, staring at the empty chairs where my family should have been. The house felt too big, too hollow, and I couldn't ignore the gnawing question in my mind. Why was I staying here? It wasn't just a trip. That much was clear now. The trip was the spark, but the fire had been smoldering for years. This feeling of being invisible wasn't new. It had been there all along, quietly growing every time they brushed me aside, every time Ethan was their priority, every time they assumed I'd be fine on my own. As I sat there in the dimly lit kitchen, something inside me shifted. I realized I was waiting for them, not just to come back from their trip, but for their validation, their acknowledgement, their love. And I've been waiting for years. But what if they never gave it? What if I spent my whole life trying to prove I was worthy, only to end up exactly where I was now, alone, overlooked, and stuck in a house that didn't feel like home? That thought was like a jolt of electricity. I pushed my plate aside and grabbed a notebook, flipping to a blank page. For the first time, I let myself imagine a life that didn't revolve around them. What would it look like if I stopped waiting for their approval? The more I thought about it, the clearer it became I needed to leave. Not out of spite or rebellion, but because staying here wasn't an option anymore. This house, this dynamic, this entire way of living, it was suffocating me. I wasn't sure where I would go or what I would do, but I knew I couldn't stay. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, that their neglect didn't hurt, that I could just brush it off and move on. As I scribbled down ideas, a plan began to take shape. I had some savings from my part-time job. Not a lot, but enough to get me started. I could find a place to rent, something small and affordable, and start building a life on my own terms. I wasn't naive. I knew it would be hard, but the thought of staying here, in this house, waiting for them to come back and pretend like everything was fine. It was unbearable. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing with possibilities, fears, and a strange sense of hope I hadn't felt in a long time. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, imagining what it would feel like to finally take control of my life. The next morning, I got up early and started looking for jobs and apartments online. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. Not my friends, not my extended family, and certainly not my parents. This was my decision, and I didn't want anyone trying to talk me out of it. By the end of the day, I had a list of potential places to check out and a few job applications ready to submit. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As the days passed, I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. Every step I took, every email I sent, every phone call I made, felt like a small rebellion against the version of me they had created in their minds. The version that was quiet, obedient, and content to wait in the shadows. I started packing my things, carefully and methodically, so they wouldn't notice anything was missing when they came back. I boxed up the parts of my life that mattered most and left behind the things that tied me to this place. A deliberate shedding of the weight I'd been carrying for so long. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when doubt crept in. What if I was making a mistake? What if leaving only made things worse? But then I'd remember the way they had looked at me during dinner that night. So dismissive, so certain that I would just accept their decision without question. And every time I thought about that, my resolve grew stronger. I wasn't waiting for them anymore. This was my life, and it was time I started living it on my own terms. By the time their vacation was winding down, my plan was almost complete. I didn't know how they would react when they came back and found the house empty, but for the first time, I didn't care. Because this wasn't about them. It was about me. The morning after my decision, I woke up with a sense of clarity that felt foreign yet empowering. It wasn't like all my doubts had magically disappeared. They were still there, whispering in the back of my mind, but they were drowned out by something stronger: determination. I knew this wasn't a move I could make impulsively. If I was going to leave, I wanted to do it right. I sat down at the kitchen table, notebook in hand, and started outlining my plan. The first step was obvious: figure out where I was going. I opened my laptop and began searching for rooms to rent. I didn't need anything fancy, just a place where I could start fresh. After a few hours of scrolling through listings, I remembered a conversation I'd had with a friend months ago. She'd mentioned that her cousin had a spare room she was renting out. It wasn't far from where I live now, just a few towns over, but it was far enough to feel like a fresh start. I called my friend and asked if the room was still available. To my relief, it was. Her cousin Liz was happy to rent it out for a reasonable price, and she didn't seem fazed by the fact that I wanted to move in so quickly. "It's yours if you want it," she said. With housing sorted, the next step was finding a job. I had some savings from my part-time gig, but it wasn't enough to live on for long. I spent the next few days scouring job boards and sending out applications. The work wasn't glamorous, mostly retail and entry-level positions, but I wasn't looking for a dream job. I just needed something to keep me afloat while I figured out the rest. To my surprise, I got a call back almost immediately. A small coffee shop in the area was looking for a barista, and they were willing to hire me on the spot after a quick phone interview. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As the pieces started falling into place, I began packing my things. I didn't want to rush the process or leave any obvious signs that I was planning to leave, so I did it slowly and methodically. Each night, I'd fill a box or two with the essentials: clothes, books, personal items, and hide them in the back of my closet. There was something strangely therapeutic about it. With every box I packed, it felt like I was reclaiming a part of myself that I'd lost somewhere along the way. I wasn't just packing up my belongings. I was packing up my hopes, my dreams, and the version of me that had been waiting for permission to exist. While I worked, I kept an eye on my parents' social media. Their vacation was everything they had promised it would be: beach sunsets, fancy dinners, and countless pictures of Ethan grinning like he owned the world. Each post stung a little, but it also fueled my resolve. They were living their dream, and now it was time for me to live mine. By the end of the week, my plan was nearly complete. I had signed a lease for the room with Liz, secured my part-time job at the coffee shop, and even mapped out the best route to my new home. The only thing left was the actual move. I decided I'd leave the day before they were scheduled to come back. That way, I wouldn't have to face their questions or deal with the inevitable guilt trip. I wanted them to come home to an empty house and realize for the first time what it felt like to be left behind. As the departure date approached, I felt a strange mix of emotions: excitement, fear, and a quiet sadness for what could have been. I knew this wasn't just about the trip anymore. This was about breaking free from a pattern that had defined my entire life. On the last night before I left, I sat in the living room with my packed bags lined up by the door. The house was eerily silent, but for once, it didn't feel suffocating. It felt like a blank slate, like the calm before a storm. I thought about leaving a note, something to explain why I had made this decision. But as I stared at the blank piece of paper, I realized there was nothing I could say that they would truly understand. My actions would have to speak for themselves. When the morning came, I loaded my car with my belongings and took one last look around the house. It was strange to think that this place, which had once been my home, now felt like a stranger's house. As I drove away, I felt the weight of years of neglect and invisibility start to lift. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for them to see me or value me. I was choosing myself, and that choice felt like freedom. This wasn't just an escape. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where I finally took control of my own story. The day I left felt surreal, like I was floating just outside my own body, watching everything unfold from a distance. The house, once so familiar and full of life, now seemed like a hollow shell. Every corner, every piece of furniture, every shadow on the wall felt like it belonged to someone else. I walked from room to room one last time, taking in the memories etched into the walls. The dent in the kitchen table where Ethan and I had knocked over a glass during an argument. The faded marks on the living room wall from where my mom had measured our heights as kids. Even the worn-down carpet on the stairs carried echoes of a life that once felt whole. But now, those memories felt distant, like they belonged to another version of me, one who hadn't yet learned how it felt to be left behind. I had packed everything the night before, loading most of it into my car under the cover of darkness. All that remained was my backpack and a box of keepsakes I couldn't bring myself to leave behind. I carried them to the car and gently placed them in the trunk, pausing for a moment to steady my breathing. When I turned back to face the house, it felt colder than ever. Not physically, it was a sunny, crisp morning, but in a way that seeped into my bones. This house had been my sanctuary once, a place where I thought I was safe, loved, and seen. Now it felt like a monument to all the ways I had been overlooked. Standing there, I debated whether to leave a note. Part of me wanted to explain everything, to lay out my feelings in a way they couldn't ignore. But another part of me knew it wouldn't matter. No note, no words could make them understand what it felt like to be cast aside, time and time again. I sat on the front steps, staring at the blank notepad I'd brought with me. What could I even say? Thanks for leaving me behind. It made me realize I deserved better. It felt pointless. After a long moment, I tore the blank page out of the notepad, folded it neatly, and left it on the kitchen counter. It wasn't a message, but maybe the silence of it would speak louder than words. I locked the front door and slipped the key under the mat, my hands trembling slightly. As I straightened up, I took one last look at the house. It was the same as it had always been, but now it felt like it belonged to strangers. When I climbed into my car and turned the ignition, the familiar rumble of the engine brought a small sense of comfort. This car, at least, was mine. It was my escape, my freedom, my way forward. As I pulled out of the driveway, a wave of fear washed over me. Was I really doing this? Leaving everything I'd ever known, stepping into a world of uncertainty? But that fear was quickly followed by something else: exhilaration. For the first time, I was in control of my own life. The drive to my new home was a blur of emotions. The closer I got, the lighter I felt, as though I was shedding layers of doubt and insecurity with every mile. But there were moments when the weight of what I was leaving behind crept back in. I thought about my mom's voice, my dad's laugh, even Ethan's infuriating smirk. I wondered if they would notice I was gone right away, or if it would take them hours to realize the house was empty. When I finally pulled up to Liz's house, my hands were shaking. It wasn't much, a modest two-bedroom place in a quiet neighborhood, but it felt like a palace compared to where I'd just come from. Liz greeted me at the door with a warm smile and helped me carry my boxes inside. "This is your space now," she said, gesturing to the small, cozy room at the end of the hall. "Make it your own." As I unpacked, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. It wasn't just about having a new place to live. It was about having a space that was mine, where I could finally breathe and be myself without the weight of my family's expectations dragging me down. That first night in my new room, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, letting the silence settle around me. It was a different kind of silence than the one I'd felt at home. This silence wasn't heavy or oppressive. It was freeing, like a blank canvas waiting to be filled. I thought about everything I'd left behind. The house, the memories, the version of me that had always put everyone else's needs before my own. And for the first time, I didn't feel regret. This was my chance to start over, to build a life where I was the priority. And as I drifted off to sleep, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in years. Leaving wasn't just an escape. It was a beginning. The first 3 days after I left were a strange mix of relief and tension. On the one hand, I felt a profound sense of freedom. I woke up each morning in my small new room with the knowledge that I was in charge of my own life now. No one was asking me to clean up after them or manage the household while they jetted off to tropical vacations. But on the other hand, I knew the silence wouldn't last forever. My family was due back soon, and it was only a matter of time before they discovered I was gone. I tried to prepare myself for the fallout, but no amount of mental rehearsal could truly brace me for the moment it came. It started with a text from my mom, short and to the point. "Where are you? We came back, and you're not here." At first, I just stared at the message, my heart pounding in my chest. I could picture them walking into the empty house, expecting to find everything just as they'd left it, only to realize I wasn't there. I wondered what their initial reactions had been. Confusion? Anger? Worry? The text kept coming. My mom's tone shifted from concern to frustration as the minutes ticked by without a response. "Why didn't you tell us you were leaving? This isn't funny. Your name? Call me right now." I ignored them all, unsure of what to say. What could I say? That I'd left because I was tired of being treated like an afterthought? That their actions had made me feel invisible in my own family? No matter how many ways I tried to phrase it in my head, none of it felt like enough. A few hours later, my dad called. I let it go to voicemail, and when I listened to the message, his voice was calm, but laced with irritation. "We're trying to understand what's going on here," he said. "Please call us back. We need to talk." As the day wore on, the guilt started to creep in. I knew my decision was the right one, but that didn't make it easy. My parents weren't perfect, but they weren't monsters either. Part of me felt like I owed them an explanation, even if I wasn't ready to have a full-blown conversation. Eventually, I decided to send a text. I kept it short and direct, not wanting to leave room for argument. "I'm safe. I've moved out. I need some space." It felt like ripping off a Band-Aid. My thumb hovered over the send button for what felt like an eternity before I finally pressed it. Once the message was sent, I turned off my phone and shoved it into a drawer, not ready to face whatever response might come. For the rest of the night, I tried to distract myself. I unpacked more boxes, rearranged my room, and even watched a few episodes of a show I'd been meaning to catch up on. But no matter what I did, my thoughts kept drifting back to my family. Were they angry? Hurt? Confused? When I finally turned my phone back on the next morning, the flood of notifications confirmed my suspicions. My mom had left a series of increasingly emotional texts, ranging from "we're worried about you" to "how could you do this to us?" My dad had left another voicemail, this one shorter and more direct. "We just want to talk. Please call us." Even Ethan had chimed in, though his message was predictably less concerned. "Wow. Dramatic much?" He'd written, followed by an eye-roll emoji. I wanted to scream. None of them seemed to understand why I'd left, or if they did, they weren't willing to acknowledge it. To them, I was the one in the wrong, the one causing unnecessary drama. Over the next few days, the messages continued. My mom's tone swung wildly between anger and guilt-tripping. One minute, she was accusing me of being selfish. "We raised you better than this." The next, she was pleading, "We miss you. Please come home." I didn't know how to respond, so I didn't. Instead, I focused on settling into my new life. I threw myself into my new job at the coffee shop, learning how to steam milk and perfect latte art. Liz, my roommate, turned out to be a kind and understanding presence, giving me space when I needed it, but also checking in to make sure I was okay. Still, the weight of my family's messages lingered. I found myself rereading them late at night, even though I knew it wasn't healthy. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being unfair to them, even as I reminded myself that they'd been unfair to me first. One evening, Liz found me sitting on the couch, staring blankly at my phone. "You okay?" she asked, sitting down beside me. I hesitated, then nodded. "It's just my family," I said. "They're not taking my leaving very well." She tilted her head, considering me. "Do you regret it?" I thought about her question for a long moment. "No," I said finally. "I don't, but that doesn't mean it's easy." Liz nodded, her expression sympathetic. "Sometimes doing what's right for you feels like the hardest thing in the world. But that doesn't mean it's wrong." Her words stuck with me long after she went to bed. Maybe this wasn't about making them understand right now. Maybe this was about giving myself the time and space to heal, even if they didn't get it. For now, that was enough. After my text, the silence didn't last long. Within hours, the calls and messages started flooding in, each one pulling me back to a place I was trying to escape. My mom, always the most vocal in the family, unleashed a barrage of texts that swung between guilt-tripping and outright anger. "How could you do this to us?" she wrote in one message. "Do you have any idea how worried we've been? This isn't like you." A few hours later, her tone shifted completely. "Please just come home so we can talk. We'll work this out, I promise. You don't have to do this alone." The inconsistency was jarring. One moment, she was demanding an explanation as though I owed her one, and the next she was pleading for reconciliation. It was the emotional equivalent of whiplash, and it left me more drained than I expected. My dad, on the other hand, was more restrained but no less persistent. He left voicemails instead of texting, each one carefully worded to guilt me into calling him back. "You can't just leave your family like this," he said in one message. "We've always been there for you. This isn't the way to handle things." Another voicemail came the next day. "I don't know what's going on with you, but running away isn't the solution. You're being selfish, and that's not who you are." Selfish. That word stuck with me, echoing in my mind long after I deleted the message. Was I being selfish? I replayed the past few months in my head, trying to pinpoint the moment when I had crossed some invisible line. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized something important. I wasn't running away. I was choosing myself for the first time in my life. Ethan, predictably, wasn't as subtle. His messages were a mix of mockery and annoyance, as if my leaving was just a mild inconvenience to him. "Are you serious right now?" he wrote. "This is so dramatic. Even for you." Another text followed a few hours later. "Mom and Dad are losing it over this. Just come home and stop being so extra." His lack of empathy didn't surprise me, but it still stung. To him, my decision was just another way for me to act out, as if I was a rebellious teenager and not someone trying to break free from years of being overlooked. I didn't respond to any of them. As the days went on, their messages became less frequent, but more intense. My mom sent long, rambling texts about how much she loved me and how she couldn't understand why I would do something like this. "I know we're not perfect," she wrote, "but we've always done our best for you. If you were upset, you should have talked to us. We're a family. We're supposed to stick together." There was again the implication that I was the problem, that I should have spoken up more, tried harder, or been more forgiving. But the truth was, I had spoken up. I had tried, and every time, my feelings had been dismissed or overshadowed by someone else's needs. One evening, I sat on the couch with Liz, scrolling through my messages while she read a book. She glanced over at me and raised an eyebrow. "They're still at it, huh?" "Non-stop," I said with a sigh. "It's like they can't decide if they're mad at me or just want me to come home so they can pretend this never happened." Liz set her book down and looked at me thoughtfully. "Have they actually apologized? Like, really acknowledge what they did to make you feel like this was your only option?" I thought about her question for a moment, then shook my head. "No. They keep saying they're worried or that they miss me, but it's more about how my leaving affects them, not why I left in the first place." Liz nodded. "That's the thing about people who've never been held accountable. They think your reaction is the problem, not their actions." Her words hit me like a ton of bricks. She was right. My family wasn't upset because they understood my pain. They were upset because I had disrupted their narrative. I was no longer the quiet, reliable one who stayed in the background, and that made them uncomfortable. That night, I replayed all the voicemails and reread all the texts, trying to find even a shred of real acknowledgement. But it wasn't there. Every message was about their feelings, their confusion, their disappointment. For the first time, I realized that I didn't owe them anything. Not a detailed explanation, not a carefully worded response, and certainly not an apology. I wasn't responsible for their inability to see the truth. The next morning, I sent a single text to my mom. "I love you, but I need space. Please respect that." She didn't respond right away, and for a brief moment, I worried I'd gone too far. But as the day went on, I felt lighter, like I had finally drawn a line in the sand. The calls didn't stop completely, but they became less frequent. My dad sent one last voicemail, his tone softer than before. "We just want you to be happy," he said. "But we miss you, and we hope you'll come back when you're ready." For the first time, his words felt genuine. Maybe they were starting to understand, or maybe they were just tired of fighting. Either way, it didn't change my decision. I wasn't ready to go back. I wasn't sure if I ever would be. But for now, I was learning how to live on my own terms, free from their expectations and guilt. and that, I realized, was worth everything. The first few weeks in my new home were a mix of chaos and calm. Chaos, because adjusting to my new routine was no small feat between juggling shifts at the coffee shop, unpacking boxes, and navigating life in a new neighborhood. I was constantly on the move. Calm because for the first time, the noise in my head had quieted. I didn't wake up every morning dreading the weight of being overlooked or dismissed. Instead, I felt something unfamiliar: peace. My new job at the coffee shop was both rewarding and exhausting. I spent long hours on my feet, learning how to work the espresso machine and memorize regulars' orders. The rush of the morning crowd was a challenge, but it was also exhilarating. I liked the rhythm of it, the hum of conversation, the hiss of steaming milk, the clink of ceramic mugs. The job wasn't glamorous, and the pay wasn't much, but it gave me a sense of purpose. Every paycheck, no matter how small, was a tangible reminder that I was standing on my own 2 feet. The rent for my room was steeper than I'd expected, which left little wiggle room for luxuries. I learned how to stretch every dollar, cooking simple meals and finding free ways to enjoy my time. Some evenings, Liz and I would sit in the living room with mugs of tea, swapping stories about our lives and laughing over bad reality TV. Liz quickly became more than just a roommate. She became a friend. She had a knack for knowing when I needed space and when I needed someone to talk to, and her kindness made the adjustments so much easier. "You're tougher than you think," she said one night as we sat on the couch. "Starting over isn't easy, but you're doing it. And you're doing it well." Her words stuck with me. Every little step felt like a victory, from making my first rent payment to getting a compliment from a customer at the coffee shop. These weren't milestones I'd ever thought about before, but now, they felt monumental. Slowly, I started to build a life that felt like mine. At work, I began forming friendships with my coworkers, who were a quirky, tight-knit group. We bonded over late-night shifts and shared complaints about difficult customers. And before long, I found myself being invited to hangouts after work. One night, we all went to a local open mic night at a tiny bar downtown. It wasn't something I'd ever done before, but it felt good to be out, surrounded by people who didn't see me as the quiet, dependable one who always faded into the background. Here, I wasn't anyone's shadow. I was just me. I also joined a local community group that hosted everything from book clubs to volunteer events. It was a small but welcoming space, and it gave me a chance to connect with people outside of work. One weekend, we organized a cleanup at a nearby park, and by the end of the day, I was sweaty, tired, and happier than I'd been in months. There were hard days, of course, days when the loneliness crept in, when the silence of my new room felt less like freedom and more like isolation. On those days, I thought about my family and wondered if they missed me. I'd replay their messages in my mind, trying to convince myself that I'd made the right choice. But over time, those thoughts became less frequent. I stopped feeling like I had to justify my decision, not to them and not to myself. Leaving wasn't an act of rebellion or selfishness. It was an act of survival. It was about carving out a space where I could exist on my own terms, without being overshadowed or dismissed. One evening, as I was walking home from work, I passed a bakery with a chalkboard sign that read, "The life you want is waiting for you. You just have to take the first step." I stopped and stared at it for a long moment, letting the words sink in. They felt like a confirmation of everything I had been working toward, a reminder that I wasn't just running away from my family, but running toward something better. Looking back, I realized how much I had grown in such a short time. I wasn't the same person who had sat at that dinner table, crushed by the realization that I didn't matter as much as I thought I did. I wasn't waiting for anyone to see me or validate me anymore. I was building a life that made me proud, one step at a time. It wasn't perfect. My job could be grueling, my budget was tight, and I still had moments of doubt. But it was mine. And for the first time, that was enough. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about all the things I still wanted to do, the goals I'd scribbled in my notebook when I first made the decision to leave. I didn't know when or how I'd accomplish them, but for the first time, I believed I could. Because I had already taken the hardest step, I had chosen myself. And there was no going back. It's been a year since I left home, though some days it feels like a lifetime ago. In that time, I've grown in ways I never thought possible. I've learned how to stand on my own 2 feet, how to create a life that feels like it belongs to me, and most importantly, how to value myself. I still think about my family, but the ache that used to accompany those thoughts has dulled. It's no longer a sharp pang of hurt or anger. It's more like a faint echo of something that once was. My parents still reach out occasionally. Their message is a mix of tentative warmth and cautious curiosity. They've stopped trying to guilt me into coming back, though I can sense the unspoken hope in their words. I've started responding to their messages, though not as often as I used to. Our conversations are polite, even friendly at times, but there's a distance that wasn't there before. Things between us are different now, and I've made it clear that if they want to be part of my life, it has to be on equal terms. Setting boundaries with them wasn't easy. At first, they didn't understand why I was being so firm. My mom, especially, struggled to accept that I wasn't willing to just move on without addressing the issues that had led me to leave in the first place. "We're your family," she said during one of our phone calls. "Can't we just put this behind us and start fresh?" I sighed, choosing my words carefully. "Mom, I want to move forward, but that doesn't mean ignoring what happened. I need to know that my feelings matter to you, that I matter." She was quiet for a long time before finally saying, "You've always mattered to us. Maybe we just didn't show the way we should have." It wasn't a full acknowledgement of the hurt they'd caused, but it was a step. Ethan, on the other hand, has barely reached out. He sent me a text on my birthday, a half-hearted happy birthday. "Hope you're doing well," and I haven't heard much from him since. I'm not surprised. He's always been good at avoiding difficult conversations, and I doubt he even realizes how much his actions affected me. But I've stopped expecting an apology from him. I've stopped waiting for any of them to fully understand what it felt like to be left behind. Instead, I've focused on understanding myself, on figuring out what I need to feel whole. And the truth is, I've found that wholeness in the life I've built. Over the past year, I've achieved things I never thought I was capable of. I've paid my bills on time, decorated my room with secondhand finds that make it feel like home, and even started saving a little money each month. I've grown closer to Liz, who has become one of my closest friends. Together, we've tackled everything from late-night heart-to-hearts to spontaneous road trips, and I can't imagine getting through this past year without her. My job at the coffee shop, though still demanding, has become a place where I feel valued. I've been promoted to shift supervisor, and my co-workers have become a second family. They celebrated with me when I hit my 1-year anniversary of leaving home, raising their cups in a toast to freedom and fresh starts. In a strange way, I'm grateful for what happened. Their decision to leave me behind hurt more than I can put into words, but it forced me to take control of my own life. Without that moment of betrayal, I might never have found the courage to leave, to grow, to carve out a space where I could finally thrive. There are still hard days when I feel the weight of loneliness or wonder what it would be like to have a closer relationship with my family. But those moments are fleeting, and they're outweighed by the pride I feel in what I've accomplished. Sometimes, I look back at the version of myself who sat at that dinner table a year ago, blindsided by the realization that I wasn't as important to my family as I thought. I wish I could tell her that it gets better, that the pain she's feeling will eventually give way to strength and clarity. Funny how things work out, isn't it? What felt like the end of the world turned out to be the beginning of something beautiful. I don't know what the future holds for me or my family. Maybe we'll find our way back to each other one day, or maybe the distance will remain. But either way, I'm at peace with where I am now, because I've learned that sometimes choosing yourself is the most important decision you'll ever make. And I'll never regret taking that first step toward the life I was meant to live.